Hey everybody, I wanted to do another video here covering some React topics, specifically React Native. This is where I've been sort of for the past couple of years. I've been on a few different React Native projects, and one of the projects I'm working on right now is this really cool project called Threadable. I'm not going to go into too much detail in terms of like what this project is, but we solved a really cool technical problem, which was building native modules in Swift and bringing those in to our React Native project. Which I haven't seen a ton of examples out there. I knew people could do it, and it wasn't super straightforward to me, so I wanted to walk through it because it's actually pretty straightforward. It wasn't as difficult as I thought. But Threadable, for context, is what we call a semi-social e-reader that we're building on iOS and going to later ship to Android. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to read up more on the app itself, but just to show sort of a quick example here. You can read a book, click on an annotation or a highlight, and you can see what your friends are saying about that particular book. You can start a discussion, so you can have your own book clubs in here. You can easily comment or highlight here and leave a highlight to come back to later, and your friends can see this stuff and interact with it. And the specific thing that I wanted to cover was how we built this e-reader, but more specifically how we got to this, which was the comment and highlight endpoints. Just for context, what Threadable is built on top of is reading EPUB files. So EPUB files are just packaged HTML and CSS. It's like the base standard for ebooks out there. So this is technically a web view, right? That makes sense because we're parsing HTML and CSS. It only makes sense to do this within a web view. So how do we then get to this point, right? Comment and highlight instead of the normal copy, lookup, and share. It was really important for us to keep this sort of native highlight feel. There are some other apps that do similar things, but they actually overwrite this, and it doesn't feel as natural when you're using your fingers. So we wanted to make sure we kept this. And yeah, that just sent me down this really long rabbit hole of how you build native modules. I even tried to do it in Objective-C. I actually have a PR into react-native-webview that sort of mostly did this, you can see, but I couldn't figure out how to get rid of these things. And that was because the way that this is built in Objective-C, it doesn't actually overwrite the WebView class. It creates a view that has a subview in it that is a WebView. So it wasn't super straightforward to me. I'm obviously not very good with Objective-C either. I found it really confusing. And doing it in Swift, I was able to do it in just a few lines. So I wanted to cover that today, show you how we built this, show you how you can easily leverage Swift for native modules. There are a couple examples out there, but I found them to be pretty basic, like simple UI views, and the React Native documentation actually does have an example of creating your own custom web view, but this is all in Objective-C, which again, I've just find it so confusing. So we're going to do it in Swift. Okay, so I have spun up just a default React Native project. Not going to go into too much detail into how to build stuff with React. We're just going to jump right into building some native modules. So the default boilerplate here, we have our app.js, and let's just clear some of this stuff out because I don't really care about it. So if we get to here, and if I save that, what does that look like? Welcome to React, and we'll even get rid of the header. There we go. We just have a blank screen. Okay, so we're going to just create our own component here in Swift. And to do that, what you want to do is open the project in Xcode. So I just clicked open here to open in my Finder. You have to go into the iOS directory, and you have to open the XC workspace file. Don't open the XC code proj. You want to open the actual workspace. If you're trying to run the app and you get some errors related to Yoga Kit, that means you most likely opened the wrong project. Close it and then just reopen it. It's really frustrating because visually they look exactly the same, but you have to do this one if you want to build your own native modules. All right, so we have this open in Xcode now. And you might be wondering, can I just use VS Code or wherever my code editor is? Yes and no. I still recommend even the writing the code part, which you can absolutely do in VS Code. Just use Xcode. The IDE is going to be really handy. I know it's not the most fun software to use, but it's just going to save you some headaches. So the first thing we're going to do is just add a new file. So go to File, New, and you're going to get a bunch of options here. We're going to go with the first one, which is a Swift file. We're going to create our own Swift component. Make sure that the right project is selected here. You actually want to go down to the group, and make sure that this is checked. It should be by default. And we're going to give our file here a cool name. So cool WebView, lowercase e, WebView manager. So we're actually going to create a manager file. Right, a manager file is going to manage a particular view, and we'll go into more detail on that. But our manager file is actually going to be pretty straightforward. So the first time you create a Swift file in a project, you're going to be prompted with this: create bridging header. That's because Xcode recognizes that this is an Objective-C project, and it needs to create a bridge between Objective-C and Swift in order for us to use the Swift module. So go ahead and click Create Bridge. It's going to do that automatically for you, and you only have to do that once. So let's actually start there. We're going to start, once this is done thinking, by jumping into our bridge header file. And you can see it has absolutely nothing in it. So we're going to import the things that we need from React Native. These are part of the React Native project. So we're going to import react/rct bridge module.h, and we're going to import react/rct, which is just an abbreviation for React View Manager, because we are going to export some views. If we were just doing calculations or something in Swift or Objective-C, we wouldn't need this, but we're building a really cool WebView manager. So the next thing is building said WebView manager. So this is an Objective-C module ultimately, even though we're writing it in Swift. So we're going to create a class called Cool Web View Manager, and that's going to extend the React View Manager, which is why we have to export it from our bridge file. And we're going to override the default view function. And if you're not familiar with this syntax, I'm still not super familiar with this syntax either. Just Google it. So we're going to define a function. What is it going to return? It's going to return a UI view. And right now, let's just start really simple. I just want to show some text on the page. So let's create a label using UI label. And we'll say label.text equals, hey there. And maybe we'll align this with the center, and we'll return that label. These linting errors should go away. Expected dictionary type value. Oh, God. Oops, there's not supposed to be a colon there. That's just a typo. Okay. So now we should, well, we can't just run it now. Actually, we still have to export this to React. So the next step here is to create yet another file. And here we're actually going to be creating an Objective-C file. And we're going to call this Cool Web View Manager. That's it. We're going to give it the same exact name as our existing file. We want to make sure the same things are checked. They are by default. And we get this default Objective-C file. So we're not importing Foundation. Honestly, I don't really know what that is. We're going to import react-rct view manager.hh files, so other bridging files, and we're going to create an interface here. RCT extern module. So this is specifying what we're going to export out from our Objective-C code and make available within the JavaScript runtime. So what are we going to export? Well, we're going to export cool web view manager, and it is a view manager, and we're going to end there. So if we refresh our app here, nothing happens. So we are exporting it from Objective-C into our project. However, we're not actually bringing it in anywhere yet. Okay, so let's actually just get this view in our app here. And I'm just going to delete some of this stuff that we're not actually using. And same with this. We don't need that. Okay, so we're going to just grab our default view, which is just a UI label. But in order to do that, we have to pull in require native component. And so that's just a helper function that we get from React Native to tell it to do what exactly it sounds like it's going to do, which is grab a native component. So we're going to say const cool web view equals require that cool web view, which is the name of our thingamabobber, and then we're actually just going to throw that right here. Okay, so now that we have that running, we're getting this error here. Cool web view manager requires main queue setup since it overrides init but doesn't implement this function. And that's a pretty easy fix. Let's hop back into Xcode. We're going to edit our Swift file here, and we're going to say override a static function, so not an instance function, but a static function. And this expects to return a Boolean, and we're just going to return true. And we should be able to just refresh. Actually, we would have to completely rebuild the app, I believe. But let's also go in here and maybe add some styles just so that we can see it. There. Hey there. There's my component. And if I were to rebuild this, we would get rid of that error. I don't think it's going to recompile until we do that. So let's just keep moving forward. So we have our view manager, right? Oops, back in Xcode. Right, so a view manager is going to manage our actual instance of the view, and in this case, we want to create a web view. If all you were interested in was creating a very simple Swift component, well, then we're pretty much done. You can do that here, but for us, we're going to create yet another Swift file. So new file, and this time we'll select Swift. Make sure that the right project is selected, which it is from last time, and I didn't name it correctly. So we'll go here, new file. Next, I forgot I gotta name it here, and we're gonna call it cool web view. So this is the instance of the web view that we want to create. So we don't need foundation, but there are a few things we do need, which is the UI kit and WebKit, obviously. And we're going to create another Objective-C class called cool web view. Make sure we type it right. Class cool web view is also a UI view. And so we're going to treat this a little bit differently because we want to make a lot of custom changes to our web view here. So this is going to be a UI view that has a web view in it. Web view, and this is going to be an instance of a WK web view, which is the current iteration of web views in iOS. All right, so right now it's just a web view, right? It doesn't actually do anything or accept anything, and we actually need to create the instance of this web view, right? We're just importing the class right now, but we're going to override our init method here. We're going to give it a particular frame because we want it to take up a certain amount of space on our screen. So super.init, and we're going to pass it the frame that we're passing to this class. So WebView, that's our variable that we're creating here. We're going to say WebView equals an instance of WK-WebView. It has a frame of CGRect. CGRect takes an X and a Y position. So we're just going to say 0, 0. We're going to throw it up in the upper left corner. That way it just takes up as much space as our container in terms of like it starts at its origin. From its width, it's going to be UI screen .main.bounds.width. And height, we'll do the same thing. Height UI screen .main.bounds.height. And then we're going to say that the web view is not going to be opaque. So is opaque equals false, just so that we can see it. And self.add_subview, the variable web view. So on our UI view here, we're going to add a subview, which is our web view. And we're getting an error here. Required initializer init coder must be provided by subclass. So we're going to say, we're just going to show that we're overwriting it, and it needs to be overwritten for any instance that is using this. So coder, and I don't know this off the top of my head. I'm getting it from my notes because I had to Google this. And we're just going to raise a fatal error if our class does not have an init function, has not been implemented. So we'll save that, and then our error should go away, and it does. Okay, so now we have this cool web view, and rather than using the UI label, which we were doing here, we're just going to return an instance of cool web view. Okay, so now cannot find return. So now we have our view manager, which is being exported to React Native and is now using an actual web view here, WK-WebView, which comes from iOS for us. But it doesn't actually do anything, right? We actually want it to, let's say, accept some HTML. All right, so we're going to create another variable here, Objective-C variable, called HTML string. And that is an NS string. That's sort of our default string type here. And we'll give it a default value, which let's just call it some like HTML tags, right? It's the most basic thing that we can do. And when this is set, right? So rather than just defining it as a variable with a default value, we can actually call the did set object. So this is what happens anytime the HTML string is set, and it will call webview.load HTML string, HTML string as a string, and the base URL bundle.main.bundle URL, because we're just running this locally. We're not actually going to point it to a specific URL. So HTML string can be passed here, but how do we actually pass an HTML string from React Native into this? That is when we have to go back to our Objective-C file here that exports our component out to React Native, and we have to export a view property. And the view property's name is HTML string, and its type is NS string, just the same that we defined here, HTML string of type NS string. Okay, cool. So how do we actually access this in our JavaScript? Well, we're gonna, for now, create a new file. We'll call it just coolweb.js, and we're gonna create it as a separate component here rather than just sort of doing it inline, because now we have a lot more stuff to manage. So let's import React from React, and we're going to also do the same thing. We're going to import, require native component from React Native. And I can't type. And then we're also going to grab the component class that comes with React by default. And we're going to grab that native component here. So we're going to call it react-native-webview. We called it cool-webview in the previous file, but now I'm calling this file cool-webview. So I just want to delineate that this is a native module here. So require native component, but the native component is in fact still called cool-webview. So let's grab that, and then we're going to create our own class here. Default class extends, default class cool-webview extends component. And if you're wondering why aren't we doing this as a functional component, I haven't found an example of native modules as functional components. I've always seen them as classes. I don't know if you can do it. So we're going to keep going down that way. So we have to call our own render function here, and we're going to then render the RNC cool-webview. And let's go back here and we'll grab the same sort of styles that we had here. And let's delete this because we no longer need you. Oops. And so we're going to pass you some styles. Then we're going to pass an HTML string. So that's that property that we defined. This.props.html string. So if you're used to functional components and you've never written class components, this is how you access props. So the things that are actually passed to the components, this.props. So the object has a props property. So yeah, we are going to pass an HTML string to this. And that should be all we need to do. So now we're going to import this. Import, we'll call it cool-webview from cool-web, right? Cool capital web. And then we'll throw it in here and we'll say cool-webview. And we'll give it an HTML string. And let's actually maybe write our HTML string here. HTML, and I'm writing this as a string just because that's how we're passing it there. We'll give it a body. And maybe we'll just give it like an H1. Hi there, everyone. /H1, and maybe even give it an H2. We'll assign that to a variable. Call it HTML stuff, and we will pass that here. Okay, so if we go back to our app, it's going to crash. I found anytime you update a component that leverages a React Native component and returns it, it does not hot reload. You always have to come here and refresh the app. Nothing was returned by render. Oh, that's because I actually have to return this stupid thing. So let's do that. Force the refresh because, again, hot reload is not working. And it seems like, oh, you know what? Because we changed the native component, we're going to have to restart all of this. So let's just do yarn start again and force the refresh, and it's going to take a minute to compile. All right, so we reloaded our app, and now we have our amazing web view that is taking a string of HTML, this, right, passing it to this component we created here. This component loads in the cool web Swift component. So it's actually loading in the cool web view manager, which has an instance of our web view, which is using WK web view. And it's essentially just passing that HTML string along. And we had to define the HTML string here to say this is something that we're going to publicly expose, and we are going to pass it on to our UI view here. So Again, if you're not interested in the actual web view side of this, you just want to know how to do these steps, create a view, subviews, and pass properties to them, then hey, we did it. You can sort of go forth from here and go nuts, but we're going to keep going down this rabbit hole because we built a lot of cool features, and we're going to show you how to overwrite those UI menu options, which really is all we set out to do in the first place. So we have our web view, but remember, if I go and just click this, copy, lookup, and share, and if you remember the example from before, we had those custom ones. So how do we overwrite? How do we overwrite those? So we have to do that here, and we're going to create UI menu options, right? And when we select them, they do something. So we're going to start with the do something side of it. They're going to just call functions for now. We're going to have a comment function, and we're going to have highlight function. And we're not going to add anything to these yet, but we're going to put them in place because we're going to specify what our controls do and what functions they call. So we need to update our init method here. And let's actually add this just to the bottom here. So let's create a new variable called com, and it is going to be an instance of a UI menu item. So that is actually what those things are called. They're called UI menu items. And a UI menu item takes a title. In this case, it's going to be comment, and it takes an action, which is a selector, and that is going to be our comment function. And we're going to do the same exact thing with highlight. We'll call it high, and this will call, or the title of it will be highlight, and it will call the highlight function. And then we're going to add these to our UI menu controller. That's the actual instance of the thing that shows the UI menu items. It is a shared controller across our different views, and we're going to add these items com high. Awesome. So we come back here and refresh our app. All right, so now that it is rebuilt, you can see we now have our custom actions here, comment and highlight, but we still have these three options. So why do we have these three options? Well, that has to do with the actions that are approved for our given view. So what we have to do here, we have to edit two things. We have to specify what actions can actually be performed. So we're going to override the function can perform action. Takes an action that's a selector with sender. So we're just defining what that is, and it's going to return true or false. So this actually gets called every time we click on one of those items, and it checks to see whether it can actually take that action. So if the action equals the selector, so selector here, right, we're specifying that this function is now a selector called comment, return true. If the action equals a selector highlight, return true. Otherwise, we'll return false. Okay, so that's going to allow us to expected non-void return. Oh, I was supposed to specify that this was a Boolean. It should fix that, hopefully. Yeah, so this will set us up for these actions, right? And we are specifying which ones they're allowed to do here. However, that's only applying to this class. We aren't actually overriding the WK-WebView class, and that is technically where it gets copy, lookup, and share from. So we actually need to override it on WK-WebView, or more specifically, we need to create our own custom subclass of that WebView that overwrites that for us. So let's do that. We're going to go new file again. We're going to create yet another Swift file. And we're going to just call this sub-webview. Again, make sure this is checked. Sometimes if you quit Xcode and come back in, it won't auto-select this stuff. If you ever get an error that says a particular class is out of scope for you, this is most likely the step that you missed. Okay, so we have our little subview. We're going to do the same things before. We're going to import WebKit. We're going to import UI kit. So we have our class called sub-webview, and it extends WK-webview. And we're going to do the same thing that we did before in the other file. We're going to override the can perform action function. And that time it auto-filled for me. I don't know why I didn't do that last time. That's supposed to be a capital K. That's what it's yelling out. And we're literally just going to say return false. You cannot take any actions whatsoever. Don't even think about trying to perform a particular action. So we're literally overriding the defaults that come with WK-webview. So how do we use this? Well, now we go back to our WebView here, and we make sure that we are using sub-webview instead of WK-webview. So let's save that. Let's recompile here. All right, so once our app's actually rebuilt, we'll go ahead and test that again. And look, we only have comment and highlight now. So we got rid of those other options, and now we just have these two. The problem is they don't actually do anything, right? So what we want to do is expose some callback functions to React Native so that we can say when we click these, do something. And we want the user who's implementing this library to specify what it is they're doing. So what can we do? Well, we have to, once again, expose things to, oops, wrong file. Where am I looking? This, to the front end. So we're going to RCT, React, export. We're going to, same exact function. So I'll just copy and paste, export. We'll call it onComment. And here, it needs to be a function. So that is an RCT direct event block. So there's an event that's going to happen when we make a selection. We're going to do this for highlight as well, on highlight. Then we need to specify this, what these things are. We can't just throw them in that file and have them magically work. Much like HTML string, we have to specify them as variables here. So they're coming from Objective-C. On comment, RCT direct, event block, and on highlight. Then we're going to come down to these functions that we wrote earlier, and we're actually going to call these things. We're going to say on comment, and for now we're just going to pass it a key of comment. And we can make this much more dynamic later, but for now, let's just get it to work, and we're going to pass it highlight. Okay, so we now have these working, so let's go back to our code here and actually implement this in our class. So we want to create some functions. We'll call them onComment. That will be an event function, and we'll also have on highlight, same thing. It takes an event, and we will say it will just call this dot props dot onComment event dot native event. So native event is gonna pass the key value pair that we specified in Swift. So what I'm saying is we're going to create new props that we're going to pass to our cool web component called onComment, and one for onHighlight. Is that why it's yelling at me? Okay, so let's save that, and then we actually have to... Yeah, what? That didn't... You can't just do that, Scott. So remember, we added onComment and onHighlight to our native module. Here, let's do this parens so that it's all on a new line, because it's getting hard to read. So we specified onComment, and we will say this will call this underscore onComment, and same with onHighlight. So remember, onComment, we specified that in our Objective-C manager file. We are exporting that property so that it gets passed to our web view here. And we're specifying that it is a direct event block. So now if we come here, let's specify some things. We can do a function. We can just say console log, you clicked it. That will be for onComment. So let's go here, refresh our app. All right, so when your app has finally recompiled, we can test this. So we click comment, and look, it ran our console log here. So we pass a callback function called onComment to our JavaScript component, which then forwards it on to our React Native component, or excuse me, our native module component. We export that through, not the Arbridge file, but our Objective-C manager file to expose it to our Swift class. So that mostly covers what we can do in terms of creating a custom component with Swift. We created our own custom web view. We overwrote the UI menu options. That's what we do in Threadable. Obviously, there's a lot more that goes into that app. We have some custom callbacks that you can do with JavaScript. You can actually execute JavaScript from React Native on the web view. So those are additional things that we sort of pass along. But I think you get the gist here. If you are interested in having a little more context there in terms of how we do things like create annotations, highlight, execute JavaScript from React Native onto the web view, and sort of bubble actions up, I'm happy to go into more detail, but I thought this was a pretty good overview of how we, started with what we thought was a simple problem, ended up being a little more complicated the more we looked into it, but ended up having a pretty elegant solution, which was creating this custom web view. And then everything past that was just iterating on the same problem. But if there's anything you wanted me to go into more detail on, feel free to leave a message below. Definitely check out the Threadable app if that's something you're interested in. If you have questions on sort of how we built it, outside of just the web view, there's a lot that goes into that app. Has a nice Ruby on Rails backend. I'm happy to talk about that. My email is in my bio. And if you're interested in hiring people to build this or build a similar native app for you, reach out to me at Upstatement. This is what we do. It's our bread and butter. We love doing it. And even if you're not in a position to hire it right now, I love talking about this stuff. So yeah, feel free to reach out. And as always, thank you.